Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Mark, good to see you. I'm remiss at the fact that Josh left out the most important company that of the executives I've coached, of course, MasterClass, where you were the COO for many years. Now retired from MasterClass, still on the board. And I should let people know that you actually do coaching with Velocity now, among other esteemed coaching firms. We're very lucky to work with you. Let me read off your bio real quick. Mark Williamson is an entrepreneur and executive known for scaling transformative companies, most notably serving as the chief operating officer at MasterClass, where he drove growth from startup to hundreds of millions in revenue. Mark's passion for innovation led him to found multiple successful ventures, including Shelfari, acquired by Amazon.
Got
Did I
it.
get it right?
Yep.
Zoodles, acquired by HTC, and Restore Health, much less interesting name, but probably a great company, acquired by Zillion. Currently, Mark advises CEOs of venture-backed startups, sits on the board of directors at MasterClass, Hive Mapper, and Amplify Life Insurance, and actively supports an AI travel startup reshaping the future of travel experiences. I do want to hear more about your travel adventures this summer. Mark earned his MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management and holds a bachelor's in engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Good to see you, Mark. How are things?
Great. Great. Always great to spend time with you, Edward.
Always
Excited
great
for
to
the
spend time with
conversation.
you. It's been a while since we've done one of our lunches at Bucks, but we've got to
I
do that
know.
soon.
It has been too long. Too long. We got to do it.
Bucks on Sand Hill Road. So, today we're talking about building and running a high-performing executive team, and this is a topic very close to my heart. I know it's close to your heart. This is really what we spend most of our time doing as executive coaches, and I know it's what you spent most of your time doing as a COO of MasterClass. So I think this is going to be a very exciting and insightful conversation. Mark and I had a half-hour prepping call before this a few months ago, and I told him to like stop. I was like, hold on, hold on, hold on. Like, don't spend all the good ideas on the prep call because I want to make sure we capture all these once we're actually recording and in front of an audience. So before we jump in, Mark, I just want to check in, like, how are you? I know that you went through a very transformative process and experience when we were working together, and I wanted to just check in on that. I know you developed a meditation practice and a mindfulness. I don't want to tell your story for you, but maybe you could just share with our listeners a little bit about that experience and where you are now.
Yeah, I mean, I think Masterclass, my experience there was truly transformative on a couple of levels. As you had mentioned, I started three companies, before joining Masterclass. So certainly had the experience of, let's call it building companies from zero to one.
Yeah.
No founder starts a company with the goal of selling it, right? We all want our company to be these giant businesses that are enduring. And, I'd say each one of my companies found some form of product market fit, but never really scaled, hence the acquisitions. And one of the things about Masterclass for me was it was really an opportunity for me to learn what it takes to go from like one to 100. And
Mm-hmm.
very kind of quickly, as the business was scaling, started to realize like, whoa, I've got to change as a leader because the skills to go from zero to one are just so different than the skills you need to really go from one to 100.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why when I was at Masterclass, I realized, oh my God, this company is growing so fast that if my personal growth rate isn't faster than the company growth rate, by definition, like the company's going to outgrow me. And
Right.
so I started looking to work with a coach and feel super fortunate to have found you and to work with you in Velocity at that time because it was just transformative. I really needed to change as a leader to figure out how to not be the center of the, most founders find themselves in the beginning as the center of the organization driving
Yeah.
the business. And you've got to make this transformation of being the center yourself to saying, how do I build a team and then a company that can really kind of scale and grow quickly? And that's a really different skill set. And so, my work with you was really transformative for me. And, after I left Masterclass, you started talking to me about being a coach. And I've realized I actually love helping other founders go through that same transformation because,
Yeah.
companies today, like one of the amazing things is companies today are seeing is, things don't work. And then, oh my God, they start to work, especially in AI, and they just go vertical. And people really struggle with this question of how do I build great leadership teams to help me scale the organization I started? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I remember witnessing the transformation you went through at MasterClass. Going from someone, if I could share, you used to tell me you would like suit up
Yeah.
before going into the office, like
Yeah.
emotionally kind of like put on this like rigid shell. I remember sitting in one of your executive team meetings and sharing with you later that you had a, if I may, resting
Yeah.
asshole face in the
Yeah.
meeting.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would like your thinking face back then was this,
Totally.
right? And like as soon as you had an awareness of it, we even put like a little post-it note. Remember that in the back
Uh-huh.
of your phone? No
Yep.
RAH.
Yeah.
No RAF. No
Yeah.
RAF.
Yeah. It was right on my laptop, actually. It was like literally, and I left it on top of my laptop for, I think, 6 months just to
Yeah.
remind myself to just relax a little bit. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
relax. Yeah. Yeah. It made such a difference. Um, well, let's jump in and talk a little bit about your thinking on executive teams because this is, again, like one of the main topics we talk to founders about, CEOs. At every stage of a company's growth, from seed to Fortune 100, CEOs are dealing with these questions, right? So this is very pertinent. But I wanted to talk first about founders, early stage, they're just starting to grow, and they often wonder, like, when should I bring in a head of X? When should I bring in a head of marketing, HR, product, operations? Right? When is the right time to add those specialized leaders? Do you have like a framework for that, some heuristic to help people think through, okay, now we're 15, now we're 20, now we're 50 people. What should I have heads of? And does it really depend on the company? Or does it depend on the leader? Are we filling in for the leader's gaps? Like, what's your thinking on that?
Yeah. So the way I think about this is, look, every startup needs to be world class at something, right? And
Mm,
oftentimes the founders have got these insights. It's why they started the company, and they've got these superpowers, right? And I would say the old way of thinking about this was, oh my God, we found product market fit. Now I need to just start hiring functional leaders in every part of the company. And maybe I call them a head of, maybe I call them a VP. Uh,
hmm
but they just go off and start hiring leaders. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll almost layer themselves in some way. What I mean by that is, like a founder
Right.
who's amazing at product, right? If their genius is product and that's what's made them successful, right? They'll sometimes say, well, gee, now we're trying to scale, so I'm going to go hire a head of product. And all of a
hmm
sudden, like the product magic goes away, right? Like we probably
Mm,
all remember, I forget when it was, maybe 6 months ago, Paul Graham wrote an essay on founder mode, which had
sure.
many different interpretations. My personal interpretation of that was, oh, what we really have to do is keep founders in their zone of genius, right?
Mm,
So the first thing I'll
hmm
talk to founders about is like, look, where is your zone of genius? Like, where is it that you're actually 10x or 100x better than everybody
Yeah.
else? And then how do we think about structuring an organization around you? I remember, MasterClass had lots of great investors, and Kevin Systrom, who was the founder of Instagram, was an investor in MasterClass. So I got to spend a little bit of time with Kevin. And I remember a story about Instagram where Kevin kind of structured the organization where he could spend most of his time on product. And almost the rest of the organization kind of reported up to a COO, so that he just didn't have to
Yeah.
deal with it, right? And
hmm
so
hmm
the first thing I kind of think about is like, okay, if the founder's got a superpower, let's make sure they don't go off and like hire a head of too early in their specific
hmm
functional area that then removes their genius out of the equation. That's like the worst thing you can possibly do. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. But then how do you think about the founder who maybe stays too involved too long,
right,
right?
right.
Because then you have the founder who's like controlling the product and it's a 1,500 person company or is still actively daily in the code base and you've got a team of 500 engineers. What's like is there a transition point? Is there a point
Yeah.
when founders should be develop those leadership and management skills and not just simply be that one trick pony?
Yeah, and like we can think about this as phases, right? Like there's an old analogy that I always love, which is like the sports analogy. Let's take a basketball team, right? So in the beginning, the founders are like on the court, they're playing the game,
Yeah.
right? And eventually you've got to transition into this player coach role, right? Like where
hmm
you're both playing a little bit, but then you're kind of coaching and starting to lead the team more, right? Like I kind of think of about that as the when you're in that, 10 to 20 person phase, like you're still playing some, but you're starting to coach. Eventually you got to get off the court, you got to be the coach, right? Like you sometimes hit that like period when you're going to like 20 to 40-ish people. Then eventually like you're no longer the coach, you got to go up to the GM role, right? Like
Yeah.
you're basically hiring a coach or many coaches for your team. And then eventually, like you're not even the GM anymore. You're up in the owner's box, and then eventually you're like the commissioner of the league. It's like when you're a 1,000+ person company.
Right,
And
right.
so I think these are kind of phases,
Hmm.
and I think the important thing for founders to realize is like, okay, so let's say you're the genius product founder. You're
Yeah,
going to hit the point where like actually there's too much of the rest of the business that matters for you to be day in and day out always working on product,
right,
right?
right, 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 right,
And
right.
when you start to get stretched where it's like you can't actually do the product and run the business, that's when you got to start thinking about, okay, I do need to start letting go of these things. And that's a hard
Yeah,
moment for founders to deal with.
yeah,
But it's,
yeah. I find a lot of founders go through like a period of mourning. It's like they're grieving the loss of doing this thing that made them really excited every day, doing this thing that made them feel best in the world every day. Especially if you are like 100x product person,
right,
1,000x product person, and suddenly your board is saying you can't be making, packaging decisions anymore.
right,
Like you need someone who's in charge of packaging, or you can't be making, pixel perfect decisions on the front page of the website. A lot of founders go through a period of feeling sad, right? And feeling like, okay, so what I'm supposed to be a leader, but I'm not a very good leader. So they start to feel a little incompetent,
right.
right? And they start to
You know
lose the
what?
juice.
Yeah, and like one of the things that you actually helped me with this a ton, which is this metaphor you gave me at one point in time was I think it was editing versus writing. Like how much am I actually doing the work myself versus giving feedback on the work, right? And
Right.
so if you're a phenomenal product founder, well, look, you started probably as the product manager of the company because that's basically look, a CEO is typically like a product manager when the company's two or three people. And then eventually you've got to have the ability to identify amazing talent, get them into the role, but then help other people on that team see the world through your lens. How do you see the world, right?
Yeah.
This is something that we worked on a lot. It was like, how do
Right.
you actually start to coach and mentor people such that you teach them how you see the world so that they can start to apply how you would think about things into the business without you needing to do the work, but then you're still playing the role of editor, right? You are still
Yeah.
there in product reviews, giving feedback and making sure the product's pointing in the right direction, but you're no longer needed to actually do the individual product work. And I sometimes
That's
talk to
right.
founders about this, like, look, the mindset shift to some extent is your first job, the first product you were building was the product of the company, and then the second product you work on is the company itself.
To the company itself. That's right.
Right.
That's right. I like to say that leaders have a set of lenses through which they see the world, through which they
Yeah.
see the company and the product. And your job is to take those lenses and put them on everyone else in the company,
Yep.
right? That's where you get real scale from. Because if the leader has to go in and save every major decision or has to make every major decision, that's the definition of bottleneck. That's a company that doesn't scale, right? But if you can take those lenses off, put them on the head of product, put them on the head of engineering, put them on the head of HR, suddenly you have congruence, right? And you've got aligned executives all pointed in the same direction and not necessarily doing it exactly as the CEO would do it, but doing it with that lens for quality that really sometimes only the founder has.
That's right.
Let me, you introduced a topic a second ago, which was actually my next question. And how do you discern between adding a VP of, a head of, or a C-suite member? I mean, I think we've all met those founding teams where it's like they have a CTO, a CEO, and a CMO, right? There's only three people in the company,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
so like everyone who's added, if they're the senior most person in that role, they get a C job. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? What happens when you have to layer that person? You bring in some other people feel demoted. How do you feel about that? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think we've seen two approaches inside of Silicon Valley historically around this that have both worked, and both have their problems, right? One approach would be to say, look, titles are basically free at startups. They don't cost you anything,
Yeah.
so throw them around, and if somebody wants the title intergalactic overlord of something, like just give it to them. It doesn't freaking
Yeah.
matter, right?
Right, right,
Um,
right.
and like that's a cultural element. Just saying like, look, titles kind of don't matter. Hand them out. Now there are problems with that because all of a sudden, like if you need to layer the person, well, there's no easy way to layer a C-level person, right? Like means they tend to leave, as opposed to titles. We're going to be rigorous on titles. We're not giving anybody a big title, and in fact, like we're going to layer down on titles. Like we saw that at Facebook. Like they were really
Mhm.
kind of precious about titles.
Right.
Uh, and that can cause challenges sometimes in terms of getting great people to come in because it's like, wait a
Right.
second, I was at maybe a larger company with a better title, and now I'm going to a smaller company. It can be somewhat problematic.
They don't like the
Also,
story that tells in their resume.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
And from the potential candidate perspective, that can be a challenge. Look, we've seen both of these things work, but I tend to prefer to say, look, one of the things that almost every company goes through, and this is a challenge, is the team that you need to get from 0 to 1 tends to be different than the team you need from 1 to N, right? To really start to
Yeah.
scale up. And if you want to keep people from your 0 to 1 team, the titles you give them from 0 to 1 aren't going to be the same titles that they deserve when it's time to really start to scale this thing up. And so I
Yeah.
tend to like the more ambiguous titles of head of. It gives you some
Head of.
flexibility later on
Yeah.
if you find out that, like, hey, look, your head of marketing was amazing from 0 to 1, but from 1 to N, they probably slot more into like a director role rather than even a
hmm
VP or a C-level role.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think the founders owe it to that 0 to 1 team to try to make sure that they're thinking about how am I going to land these people in their best roles possible when there's the next phase shift of the company. Because once you find product market fit, everything changes.
Everything changes. Yeah. Yeah. I am seeing more and more companies that have heads of, and then everyone below is staff something, staff engineer, head of engineering, staff engineer. And it's like, it's just very flat, right? So
Right.
then you don't have to deal with people. Well, why is, he an associate engineer, he's a senior engineer, and he's a director, da, 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 or she's this, like, they're just like, all right, everyone, you're all staff engineers, just get to work. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And well, maybe one more thing around this, which is
yeah.
one of the things founders just generally aren't likely to think about really early in the company is kind of what is our overall people philosophy? Well, and I
hmm
sometimes think about like, okay, there's this model I really love. It's called the congruency model. And it goes like this. It's like, look, every company based on the industry they're in and their product, they've got a bunch of work they got to do to win. Well, how does the work that they have to do to win connect with the type of people that they're hiring, the culture they're trying to create, and how they're structuring the organization? Because when you have those four pieces, the work, the culture, the people, and the structure aligned with each other, things can really work.
Yeah.
When they get misaligned with each other, all of a sudden, like you're in big trouble, right? And
Yeah.
so thinking about these questions early on, right, so that you're not making decisions, around like, oh, I'm going to call that person a CMO and I'm going to give away titles. Now, all of a sudden, you're creating a culture that cares a lot about titles. Well, does that
That's
actually
right.
make sense for
You're
you? Does that have a
signaling about titles, right?
yeah, that's right. That's right. So you
Yeah.
want to think about these things, you got to be thinking about these things a little bit in advance to set things up properly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about building out that team actually, because you just mentioned like to recruit really good talent, they don't want to necessarily take a title demotion or something like that.
Right.
And we could probably talk about recruiting all day, but I think the problem we're seeing in a lot of startups is recruiting is very expensive, and 50% of executive placements fail. Those are the industry stats, right?
Yep.
And I know that you saw a lot of executive placements work at MasterClass. You saw some not work out. What did you learn about getting it right the first time?
Wow. I mean, look, we could probably do a couple hours just on this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like one way I think about this is this will vary by scale a little bit, right? So the bigger you get, the stakes get a bit higher. And
Right.
then the higher up in the organization that you're hiring, the bigger the stakes are as well. Like one experience we had at Masterclass is we had far from perfect hiring track record. And one of the things that I've learned is like, look, if you hire the wrong C-level leader, that can
hmm
set that part of the organization back 18 to 24 months, right? Let's
Yeah.
say you hire a CXO and you figure out 3 months later, oh my God, I don't think this is working. And then let's say it takes you 2 or 3 months to actually move that person on. And now, okay, now you're back on the search. Takes you another 3 to 6 months to hire somebody. That new person comes in, and what are they going to do? They're going to replace all the people that the old C-level person that you hired that was wrong. They're going to replace all of them. So it's like it can take
Yeah.
18 months before that part
Yeah.
of the organization is back on track. And I mention that because I talk to a lot of founders about, look, if you're hiring in some of these roles, you need to put in a disproportionate amount of effort to get those hires right.
Get them right. That's exactly
And
right. Yeah.
there's a
And
couple
how
of
do you get
things
them
where,
right?
yeah, there's a couple of the ways that you can, well, let's start with how you get them wrong.
Okay. That's good.
Because I forget if it's Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett. It's like, look, sometimes the way to be smart is just don't do dumb things. So like the number one mistake a lot of people will make is they're hiring when they're in acute pain of not having somebody in the role, right? If like
Mm-hmm.
you really feel like you need somebody in the role and that's the thing holding you back, therefore you got
Yeah.
to go hire, that's the time you're most likely to make a hiring mistake, right?
Right,
Because you're
right,
just
right.
in
It's
so
like it's
much
like
pain.
dating after a breakup, right?
It is. It is.
Yeah, you don't want to rebound, right, with this bad executive hire.
Yeah. And so
Yeah,
I oftentimes will talk to people like, look, number one thing to do is get yourself out of acute pain so you can make a good decision. So how do you do that? You can hire a fractional exec. You can bring on a contractor. Basically, look, one of the things I think about venture capital is sometimes used to like cover up fuck ups, right? Like it allows you to grow much faster than you naturally would, and it allows you to
mhm.
make certain mistakes. So use the capital to get yourself out of acute pain so you get into a better spot to make a good hiring decision. All right. So
Yeah.
like that's one way to
So,
just avoid it.
slow it down a little bit,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
Right. Reduce the pain, slow it down a little bit, even though that's contrary to what your instincts are telling you.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would say is that like as you're moving up, like I mentioned that if you make a poor C-level hire, that's like an 18-month mistake for that org. A bad VP hire is about a year. A bad director hire is about 6 months. A bad manager
Hmm.
hires maybe 3 months. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I started to focus on is saying, okay, how do I build a hiring process such that I can have greater and greater confidence based on the more senior they are?
Yeah.
And honestly, the number one thing I really learned was references are far more important than people think.
Yeah.
Um, if I had to choose between being able to interview somebody or do reference checks on them, I would actually pick reference checks over interviewing.
Wow. Yeah.
And
What,
when I say
how do
reference
you
check,
how do you get honest feedback in reference checks? Because a lot of times people don't want to take the risk of saying something negative.
yeah. So the number one thing for me on reference checks is early on in the call, signaling to the person I'm on the reference check with that, hey, I've talked to other people who have actually told me the truth before. So, for example, early on
Hmm.
in the call, I might say, "Hey, I talked to John Doe's previous manager, and they mentioned that the person struggled with X. Where did they struggle when they were working with you,
Hmm.
right?"
Hmm.
Um, and that would seem to like really open up, like, "Oh, okay, like we're gonna actually talk about some real stuff here, right?"
Right, 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 right.
Um, but the number of reference checks and the depth of them can really give you a massive, massive advantage. So, for example, if I was hiring a C-level executive, I'm doing probably somewhere around 25 reference calls. Um,
25 reference calls. Mark,
yeah.
that's incredible.
And
Yeah.
but these reference calls are like, let's say 15 minutes long. Like,
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
it down to a science. So if I do 25 reference calls that are 15 minutes long, it's like 6 hours of reference calls. Somebody
Hmm.
might say, like, what the hell are you doing 6 hours of reference calls for? And I say, like, how the hell can you not do 6 hours of reference calls? You're about
Right.
to hire somebody who's going to spend, I don't know, 2 to 3 thousand hours this year working on your business. And if you make this mistake, if it's a mistake, you're going to cost your company a year and a half in this org. Six
Right.
hours is nothing compared
It's
to the
nothing.
investment you're making.
Yeah.
And what it allows you to walk out of. So, what I like to do is for almost every job they've had in the past, I talk to their manager, two peers, and at least 2 to 3 direct reports. And
Hmm.
so, if you're hiring a C-level person, you're going to do that for, let's say, 5 to 7 previous jobs, right? You're going to get a really, really clear picture on the person, and you're going to see like what are their weaknesses that are still weaknesses and have stayed the same over time versus
Yeah.
like what weaknesses actually fell away. Um,
Right.
and so much so that like this process actually took my personal kind of batting average, like success rate on hiring execs, I think from probably something like 40% to 75%, which is
Wow.
just a massive, massive improvement. And it's, by the way, it also
That's
took my
incredible
close
insight and
rate.
incredible growth.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
probably took my close rate to like 90%. What I mean by close rate is once you decide you want to hire somebody, what are the odds you get them?
Yeah. Yeah. Because you can repeat back to them things that other people have said about them. Is that what it is? You know them well enough. You can say, I heard, well, what I learned about your experience here, and these people said, da, da. What what information do you glean from not being able to set up that many calls? What if people aren't willing to talk to you?
So I'll share a little bit more why it impacts the close rate, and then I'll answer the
Okay.
question like, what if you
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
get
yeah,
them?
yeah, yeah.
One of the reasons it impacts close rate so long is you can sit down with the candidate when you're making the offer and say, okay, I've talked to a ton of people. Here's what I've learned are your superpowers, and here's how we're going to leverage your superpowers in this job. Here are the specific projects we're going to put you on. Here's how I'm going to set you up for success in your
Mm-hmm.
first 30 days, in your 60 days, in your 90 days. And they're like, oh my God, like this person really knows how I want to get leveraged in the business. And then you can also say to them, look, here's from my perspective where your weaknesses likely are, and here's my development plan from you from day one. I've identified these areas where I think you probably haven't really gotten great mentorship in. I'm going to help coach and mentor you in these specific areas. Here's areas I think you've probably not had an opportunity to demonstrate skills. Here are the opportunities I'm going to create for you in your first 30, 60, 90 days to help develop you in those areas. And but you're signaling to great people, look, what do great people want? They want opportunity for their gifts to shine and they want massive growth opportunities. So what you're
Yeah.
doing in the sales call is basically delivering on both of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then
Wonderful.
all of a sudden they feel seen as a leader, right? And somewhat
Right.
cared
Right.
for, right?
They feel seen, they feel valued, and they anticipate that they will continue to feel valued, right?
That's right.
Um, you just mentioned 30, 60, 90. Great segue. That's my next set of questions. Wanted to ask how you think about setting the right level of expectations for pace, for quality, for what good looks like early on without being too on top of people. And I remember I have this vivid memory of sitting in one of the breakout rooms at MasterClass with you, and we were up on the board and we were drawing this line. Remember this? The situational leadership from
Yeah, yeah,
directing to delegating. And we talked about how the big mistake a lot of executives make when they're hiring new execs or even new VPs or directors is they bring people in, they say, great, here's your computer, here's your job description, here's your goals, here's your team. Off you go then. Trust you. You'll do a great job. Check in with me in 30 days, right?
right,
So they under involve, they under train because they want to respect this person, right? They want to
right,
show trust. And then what happens is that person goes off, they start steering off course very early. Things aren't very clear. They're not getting enough feedback. And then you check in with them 30, 60, 90 days. It's like, oh, I don't think this is going to work out. Yeah.
right,
Joe is just completely off the rails. Like his team is not really responding well. He's not building a good culture there. And I like to think that it's a little bit like teaching a kid to swim, right? You remember talking about
right.
this? When
Yep,
you first have a kid in the pool, you're holding them in the water, and then you might back away across the pool, right? Let them swim
yep,
towards you. Then you'll sit on the edge while they swim
yep,
laps. And only after months, maybe years, if it's actually a child, of them learning to swim, do you drop them off at the pool and say, "I'll be back at 4 o'clock. Don't bother the snack bar person too
that's
much,"
right.
right?
That's right.
So the mistake we often make is over delegation. I've also seen executives under delegate and be really controlling. How do you think about that balance with a brand new executive?
Yeah, so actually the process I put in place to kind of mirror that swimming metaphor was, look, the first week of an executive joining the team, I did daily one-on-ones with them. Sometimes it would stretch into 2 weeks. And it would
Wow.
basically be like, look, we're doing a 30 to 45 minute touch base at the end of every day. And your job in the first week, it's like you're going to go meet everybody. You're going to start building relationships. I'm not asking you to make big decisions in your first week or two of work, right? It's basically like, look, I'm
Mhm.
actually looking, you don't need to make any decisions. In fact, I'd prefer
Right.
if you don't, but go meet everybody, get a bunch of contacts, and every day show up to me and just bring questions. Like,
Yeah.
let me
Yeah.
help onboard you. And then, so that's kind of like the I'm holding you, like we're kind of in the
Uh-huh.
pool.
Yeah. Like
Uh,
that. Yeah.
and then it's like the week after that, it's like, okay, we're going to touch base maybe 2 times or 3 times in the week, right? It's like, okay, you're going to swim a little bit. And once you get to the point where it's like, oh, you understand the context better, you understand what's going on. Now, hopefully, now I've also set you up with a project that I have a high degree of confidence you can get a win on.
Mm.
Why is that important? Like one of the things most founders forget is that when you hire an executive, everybody else in the organization is looking at that person and waiting for them to have an impact, right? You just hired this
Yeah.
person. You're expecting to be a big leader. The organization needs to see the person put a win on the board.
Hmm.
So in
Hmm.
addition to like making sure that you set them up with a project that they can get a win on, and you're spending a bunch of time helping them on board, learn the culture and everything else, um, you're now like sometime by the third or fourth week, like they should be off, like starting to hopefully like understand the company, understand how it works, have thoughts around how to have an impact, hopefully starting to get towards the path of getting a win on the board. And at the same time, honestly, by this point in time as a leader, you should have a sense of did I make a bad hire or not? Right.
Right. Right. Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
if you're too far away and you just do hey, I'm going to drop you off at the pool and I will see you in a month and we'll see how things are going. And if they're not delivering, you may have no idea why, right? Like, did they just not get the right context? Do they not really understand the business yet? As opposed to if you're kind of really coaching and mentoring them in that first month and it's not working out at the end of the month, you've got a good sense for why.
Right, right, right. I think a lot of executives, they're told or they've learned that they need to generate massive value right out of the gate.
Right.
They need to come in, they need to shake things up, they need to be a little contrarian, right? They need to demonstrate why they're the right hire and why whoever had the role before them was a total knucklehead,
Right.
right?
Right.
So they often come in with really sharp elbows, right?
Yeah.
How do you work with an executive who's coming in hot like that? Like they need to like massively make some changes. I'm going to fire these people. I'm going to start a new thing. We need a new product. Like they're almost overreaching out of the gate because they have a story they're telling themselves that I need to prove my value really, really quickly here.
Right. Well, look, this is always going to matter on context within an organization. Let's say we're talking about an org that's doing well, you're hiring a new leader in. The answer likely should be alignment at the start, right? Remember that sell
Mhm.
conversation I mentioned earlier? Like that's where you want
Mhm.
to be aligning on what are we really expecting to have happen early on in the business, right?
Yeah,
And I think sometimes given the context of business, somebody could come in throwing elbows, reorging teams too quickly, and they can lose organizational credibility because it's like they're firing people on day one or two, and it's like, wait a second, do they even know what's really happening? Or
hmm,
it might be the total opposite, where it's like actually the company's on fire, and what we need is somebody to come in and actually make really rapid changes. So the context of what's happening in the company will matter a lot. But to me, it always comes back to that alignment early on. Is like, look, the C-level leader that's hiring this executive better align with them very quickly on like what's the pace of change we're looking for and what are the core jobs to be done in the first 30, 60, 90 days.
yeah.
Because if you're a leader and coming in and just firing everybody, like, by the way, the organization is going to react to you in a different way.
That's right. That's right. And we have a an observation by one of our attendees here. The founder also needs to see and accept their own limitations. It may not be the new hire, but a lack of communication or ability to translate their vision to the new hire. I do a lot of work with CEOs around helping people see what good looks like, right? There's nothing
Yeah,
worse than saying like, Mark, we want to build a new product. It's going to do these three things. I want you to get creative. Here's a bunch of resources. Off you go. Come back in 2 weeks. Mark, this is not what I wanted.
that's
This
right.
is not at all what I was thinking. Right. I did not do a very good job of defining to you what good would look like. Right. And it's
That's
a
right.
mistake I see people making at every level in a company. Um, Wanted to ask you a little bit about making a new hire feel included.
Yeah,
And this is something that happens again all over Silicon Valley. You've got the OGs, and you've got the new hires. You've got the
that's right.
founding team. We went through 0 to 1 together. Oh, remember that time when, oh my God, they were telling stories. There were ski trips early on 4 years ago that that person wasn't on, right? And then suddenly you've got like 5 people on the executive team who are all in, and 1 or 2 people who are new hires who are out. And I'm sorry if you hear that. The delivery guy is buzzing right now, right? And how do you take those 2 people and bring them in? What does I like to call it proactive inclusivity look like for you?
Yeah, I think the key word there is proactive, right? I think a lot of new execs will feel like outsiders because to some extent they are for a little while, and unless you manufacture opportunities for bonding to occur, like it's not going to happen. And so,
Yeah,
that bonding can happen in many ways, right? It can happen one on one, right? Like so, one of the things I mentioned when execs would start for me, the first thing I tell them is like, look, your job in the first week or two is just go build relationships. You should
yeah,
never be eating lunch alone. Like in fact, oftentimes for an executive, I would actually pre-book for them meetings with all the other leadership inside of the company. So when they're walking in, their calendar's already half booked for them. So they're
yeah.
starting to, kind of start to build those relationships. Then what you got to do is you got to get them outside of the building, right? You
I need to
just
get this. This person's not going away. I'm really sorry.
go ahead. I'll just keep answering.
He's
You
pushing
got to
my
get
button.
folks out of the building. You got to get them out to dinners, out doing events together. You've got to get them building relationships together because the quickest way to feel like an insider is to start creating those shared memories together, right?
Yeah.
To start going through things together, and building relationships, right? Because what the executives really want to feel like is they belong, right? It's really
That's
about
right.
feeling like, there's that great scene in Silicon Valley, the HBO show, where it's like they're
Yeah.
chanting "one of us," right? It's like how quickly can you feel like you're one of us, right?
Right.
And the best way to do that is to get people spending real time together, and collaborating together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kevin has a question about AI agents, which we're going to save for a little bit later because I do have that question, Kevin, in the docket here. Um, I I was working with one company. There were four founders. And so you might imagine those four founders had this like incredible bond. They read each other, or they could read each other's minds. They could finish each other's sentences, and it was really hard for anyone to break in. And they had to make an agreement whereby they wouldn't have inside jokes in executive team meetings, right?
Wow, yeah.
They
Yeah.
wouldn't talk about, oh, remember that ski trip? They wouldn't talk about, hey, see you out east, because they all had houses near each other in the Hamptons. It was just like two, right,
Yeah.
together,
Yeah.
right? So like no one could get in. And they made an agreement not to like be secret about their how close they were, but not talk about it all the time in front of
Right.
everyone else. They just made a
Right.
very clear decision to be proactively inclusive by not using exclusive language.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of doing it.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'd love to speak a little bit more about, so we talked about 30, 60, 90. Now let's imagine we're 6 to 12 months in. And how do you think about providing feedback to someone who really has to own their role, has to own their team, but you can see there's a 5% variance between where the executive team is or where the company is, whether it's culturally, strategically, and where this executive is. And if it continues and that continues to compound, there's going to be miles of distance, right, between
Yeah.
this team and the rest of the org. When you make those big hires, these are often very experienced people, big egos. I came from Amazon, I came from Microsoft, I came from wherever. How do you sit down with them and make sure that that feedback is received well and is acted upon without simply, twisting their arm?
Yeah. At least for me, a lot of this goes back to how do you start with that executive, right?
Mm, hmm.
Meaning, hopefully they're getting feedback in their first week of work, right? We're not waiting until 6 months or 12 months later, so that there's this, I mentioned earlier, I would do these daily kind of one-on-ones. At some point in that first week of one-on-ones, I'd make sure to give feedback to somebody that was some, kind of improvement feedback.
Right.
And just to set the
To
tenor of like,
someone else,
what's
not
that?
even to not even to the executive, the new executive, maybe to someone else, just to indicate we are a feedback culture. Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, I'm saying like in the one-on-ones, I would give it directly to the executive, and
Oh,
then
okay.
of course they would see me operate in meetings and give feedback as well. But the thing about feedback is if it's constant and ongoing, it's so natural, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is just kind of what we do here, as opposed to like, oh my God, I've got to like whenever there's a CEO is like, I got to give this feedback to this person, and I'm struggling to figure out how and when to do it. Really, to me, that just signals it's like, oh, feedback's not a common thing that you're doing, right? And that is a red flag, right?
Yeah. That's fair.
Where as
That's fair.
opposed to it's like, no, no, no. Like when we do our regular one-on-ones, like there's gonna be like, or we're done with a meeting. We're gonna pop out of a meeting, and if something kind of went a little astray in the meeting, is there a quick conversation after the meeting where feedback's given? If there is, then like that feedback doesn't feel monumental 6 months later that you're 5 degrees off. If you're a company that's not giving feedback regularly, it likely like you are ending up in that world that you described where it's like, oh my God, the rocket's 5 degrees off and now it's 100 miles away from destination. If we wait any longer, it's gonna be 1,000 miles away from its
Right.
destination, right? And it gets harder and harder and the stakes get higher and higher. And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it starts to me, or at least from my perspective, around like you got to start giving feedback early. In fact, part of that goes back to what I mentioned a while ago around that congruency model around culture. Well, what's the culture of feedback inside of the company,
Hmm.
right? And how do you actually
Yeah.
instill that when you're 10 people, such that when you're 100 people and you've hired your CMO, it's like, no, 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 feedback is just the thing we naturally do inside of this company. Therefore, it's quite easy to tell the CMO 30 days into their job, like, look, you're off on this dimension. We got to course correct now, right?
That's right. That's right. I really like that. I like establishing that there is a feedback culture early, right, with that individual. I like showing them that feedback is given not just to them, but to everyone else on the executive team. And I also really like when the CEO, him or herself, is proactively seeking feedback and receiving feedback publicly, right?
Right. Right.
Demonstrating that all of us take feedback well here. It's part of our culture from the CEO, from the founders to the frontline employees, right? We are actively seeking feedback. We're a learning culture. As
Yeah.
opposed to if you have a CEO who is impervious to feedback, no one can talk to, that just percolates down through the entire org, right?
And one of the things I did around this was I mentioned earlier, like during the cell call, where I'm talking about like, hey, here's the path for you, here's opportunities for feedback or opportunities for improvement for you. I would also in that cell call show them my 360 review. And I would say, look,
Uh,
you as a
hmm.
leader coming into the org, if you're going to work for me, you need to know what my strengths and weaknesses are. So look, here's where I'm doing well, and here are the things I'm working on. And by the way, if you see me struggling in these areas, I need you to give me feedback too, because feedback needs to go in both directions, right? So
Yeah.
establishing that like culture of feedback up front by being vulnerable and showing your own 360 feedback kind of makes it a little easier to get the feedback flowing in both directions.
Yeah, slow clap on that one, Mark. I remember when you were like, I'm going to share this 360 with my team, and it was a tough 360. I remember
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right? And I think that reset so many relationships in the business and developed so much trust on your team. Yeah,
Right.
like you did
Yeah.
that very boldly and proactively. And
Thank you.
it's so
Appreciate that.
great to hear that you're like continuing to do that and advising other people to do that. We've got a
Yeah.
couple comments here. They're not necessarily questions, but the senior teams are so interconnected that new hires need to build trust quickly. This is from Evelyn Rodstein. Senior team members should also be reminded that the new hire may have new ideas they can learn from. One of us means growing what? One of us means growing what us is. Um, I think what maybe what we're trying to say here is that everyone on the executive team needs to be
Mhm.
soliciting new ideas from the new hire to make them feel included. Anne is asking a question here. Would love to hear Mark's tips specifically around that 50 to 150 person scaling phase. In Anne's coaching work, it seems to be a time when many startups fail. So,
Yeah.
like, do you have any special tips for that? Like, it's almost like we're just achieving escape velocity, 50 to 150
That's it.
people. It's like now we need processes, we need formal roles, like things are really going from that squishy chaos to maybe out and out chaos, right?
Right. Right.
Or we can overplay it and get a little too rigid. How do you think about that balance?
Look, you nailed it. Like this, the world changes when you get to product market fit, and then you really start to scale. And the question is like, are you scaling too fast?
Mm,
Right? Like,
hmm
if you try
hmm
to go from 10 people to 300 people in a year, like holy cow, like you're in trouble, right? As a company,
Yeah,
like the culture's out the window, everything's going to be broken. So you got to think a lot about at what pace are you scaling, and then. The other thing that will also happen inside of this is really a hard time for founders because you typically have this core group of people that are in leadership roles that were there for you for 0 to 1.
mm,
And if you're not really intentionally kind of thinking about, do we have the right people in the right seats? This is where the company can get a lot of troubles. Sometimes this is talked about as like, hey, has the company kind of turned over? Turned over in the sense of have the people who are the 0 to 1 specialists, moved on to their next 0 to 1 thing, or are they trying to play the role of I'm going to help scale this thing without that capability, right?
right,
And
right.
so, and it's hard because rightfully so, there's an emotional attachment to these people. These are the people that like made the company successful, but they
Yeah,
may now be the people that are holding you back, right? And
right.
so it's really a challenging kind of emotional time period for a lot of founders because there's a bunch of people they've got loyalty to that might not be in the right roles. So that's another
Mhm.
way that this can go wrong. And the other thing I oftentimes talk to leaders about, especially operators, is look, the faster the company's growing, the more of a mess it is on the inside, right? If you think
Right.
about like what breaks inside of companies, two things generally break as companies scale. Processes break, and honestly, people break. I mean, the
Mhm.
joke I always use is, could you imagine being the first performance marketing manager at Uber? Like your first budget's probably like $1,000 budget, and like a year and a half later, your budget's 100 million. Well, it's
Right.
the same person who was running the $500 budget, the right person to run like the $100 million budget? Like, probably not, right?
Right. Right.
And so understanding that, like, look, they're going to be the faster you're growing, the more likely there's some level of internal chaos, and you need a lot of wisdom to identify what are the problems that actually matter versus what are the problems that don't matter. Sometimes
Hmm.
I like to talk to founders about, like, look, you have to decide what fires you're actually going to let burn, because you
Right.
you can't put out every fire, and if you try to put out every fire, you are going to burn yourself out.
Yeah.
And so you got to have a lot of wisdom around like what truly matters, as you scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I like to do with founders is just remind them this is normal,
Yeah.
right? It's supposed to feel like this. It's
Mhm.
supposed to be chaotic. You're supposed to have people who are upset. You're supposed to have people who were early who now feel, butthurt because they got layered, right?
Right.
You're supposed to have too many fires to put out. Like
Yeah.
the more we can normalize it as opposed to, am I doing something wrong?
Yeah.
Because everything feels like it's a house on fire now, right? It's
Yeah.
like, oh no, that's building a company. Well,
Yeah. I work with a
welcome
founder
to
right
the
now.
joyful ride of, 100 to 500 employees. It's total mayhem, but the challenge is figuring out what's most important at every step of the way,
That's right.
right?
I have a founder right now who's going through this, and the great thing is it took them. They were running a different business for like 2 years. It wasn't working. They pivoted, and now they're like taking off. And like he's got the perspective of like, oh my God, these problems are so much better than my old problems, right?
Right,
Like
right, right, right. As long as the quality of your problems are getting better, you're heading in the right direction.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Success does not mean problems go away. In fact, they get harder and they get bigger, right?
That's
Uh,
right.
yeah.
More money, more problems. Um, Mark, let's just spend a few minutes getting super tactical. I'd love
Yep.
to hear like what is your recipe for success from like an operating the team perspective. What I mean is meeting cadence, structure, tools that you use for accountability. How often should teams be meeting? Virtually, in person, offsites. We call this the rhythm of the business. What's your recommendation?
Yeah. Look, I think the rhythm of every business is going to be somewhat dependent upon market, right?
Hmm.
So, like if you're running a SaaS business, that's going to be a different type of rhythm than a consumer business. But all great rhythms and all great operating models seem to have some things in common. Like, and the very first thing in common is, look, what are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? Are they
Hmm.
focused and are they the right goals, right? Once you've got the goals set up, then the question is, how do you drive alignment across teams, right? Like one of the things
Yeah.
Silicon Valley focuses a lot on is OKRs, which is like you focus a lot on what are you trying to achieve, but you also need
Hmm.
to focus as leaders on what are the inputs. Do you actually have
Right.
the right people, the right technology, the right processes to set the teams up for success to go off and achieve those goals, right?
Right.
And so, okay, let's say we want to achieve some growth rate on revenue or some new product shipment. Okay, do we have the right people as inputs? Are we giving them the right amount of money to go off and spend? And then the question becomes, at what cadence are we actually sitting down and analyzing what's happening, right? Like one of the founders I worked with, like we helped set up, I worked with them to help set up goals and then say, okay, now what initiatives are you going to run inside of the business to go against those goals? And then how do we set up a monthly business review so that we're actually going to review progress against those initiatives every month in detail, right?
Hmm.
And it took, a number of months to kind of layer all this stuff in because we had to get goals set up first, then we had to get the
Yeah.
initiatives rocking, and then the team had to learn like how do you show up for a monthly business review at a level of detail where we can actually see what's happening. But that, like once that happened, he looked at me, he was like, "Holy shit, like this business is now operating like at a totally different cadence than it was before."
Right.
Because I can every month go into it's actually a 2 day series of meetings for him where he's reviewing like every major initiative in the business and getting into the details with the team and being able to do his editing right in that moment.
His editing, and you say like editing kind of like the team's work, giving them
That's right.
feedback, making sure it's moving in the right direction.
That's right.
Elon Musk has been a very controversial figure, obviously, for a
Yeah.
long time, especially in the last 6 months. But one thing I really appreciated um, was an interview with Mark Andreessen talking about how Elon can run 5 companies at the same time. And
Mhm.
basically, he set up his schedule so that one day a week he's working on the biggest problem in each company.
Yep.
He just works on one major bottleneck at a time, solves that, and then basically, if you think of a company as a manufacturing line, right, you get better output from the manufacturing line by solving each bottleneck in order of severity, right?
Yep.
So he's dealing with big problem, go to the next company. Biggest problem, go to the next company. Biggest problem. And it's a little bit like what you were just saying in terms of sitting down, looking at all the teams and fine tuning and editing what they're doing,
That's
right?
right.
As
That's right.
opposed to constantly staying on top of everything.
That's right. The
Yeah.
other thing that, I mean, like to a large extent, what Elon's doing there is demonstrating the recognition of where is their leverage inside of each business, right?
Right.
Leverage meaning like identifying what is the actual most important problem that needs to get solved to
Mhm.
unbottleneck the system, right?
Right,
And
right, right, right.
you
And
know,
that's different from the most urgent problem or the most
that's right.
talked about problem, the most public problem. It's the problem that is keeping you from growing as a business, whatever that is.
That's right. And oftentimes, like I'll talk to founders a lot about like this notion of the Eisenhower box, right? Important and
Yep.
urgent, right? And most founders spend all their time in the important and urgent category, not realizing the thing that's likely holding their company back is the important but not urgent stuff.
Right.
And talking to leaders about like how do you carve out time to get to the important but not urgent, because oftentimes that's foundational stuff for the company to be successful. But
Hmm.
only the stuff moves from important and not urgent into urgent when something's really broken, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, you've got great clients. I have some clients who are dealing with urgent but not important at all. Um,
Yeah.
that's such a geeky coach joke there. But
Yeah.
we only have a couple minutes left. I want to encourage folks who have questions for Mark to put them in the chat. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. I have the chat open right now, so you can drop those in there. And Mark, I want to get to the question that Kevin had a few minutes ago. You were one of the people who was one of the earliest adopters of ChatGPT. I
Yep.
think I remember a conversation back in 21 or 22. You were using it daily, right?
Yep.
And I was a bit of a Luddite at that point. I just refused to engage until it got better or smarter. But
Mm.
the question I have is, where do you think we are in this trajectory of heading towards a future point where a CEO could potentially have AI agents for every major executive function in the business? Like,
Look, that
and,
world.
like, what's the gap now? Um, what are we excited about that? Are we concerned about that? You know, what should we be thinking about as human beings who want to stay relevant and employed moving forward over the next 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, I'll go back to kind of first principles to answer this, which is if we think about technology as providing us as human leverage, right?
Hmm.
I mean, technology allows us to do more work. What we're inventing when it comes to artificial intelligence is one of the largest levers of all time, right? And so I encourage everybody who's listening to this to realize that AI is this super lever that will allow you to have a larger and larger impact. And your job will be to be one of the best users of AI and to be on the forefront of AI. That's the best way to have job security is to understand how to use this technology
Hmm.
because there's wise application of the technology and unwise application of the technology, right?
How do you
Somebody
discern between those two? What's wise, what's unwise? As an example.
Yeah, like so if you don't have a lot of depth of understanding of where the technology excels and where it struggles at any given point in time, you're
Hmm.
unlikely to be wise in your application of it. So if Edward, you and I were to start a business together today and we said, okay, we want our entire team to be made of agents, that would be unwise. Like the technology is not quite there yet, right?
Right.
But if we said to ourselves, gee, we need to do a lot of market research and market analysis. Let's go off and hire a bunch of analysts to do this job today. Well, that's also unwise because AI is actually phenomenal at that type of work right now,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so every leader needs to be on the cutting edge of understanding what's possible with these technologies because you have to
Hmm.
assume your competitors are going to be on the cutting edge, right? One of
Yeah.
the things I like to say about AI is historically companies have viewed themselves their greatest assets. What are companies' greatest assets? So I'll say our people and our processes are our greatest assets. Well, guess what? Those greatest assets are about to turn into your greatest liabilities in a world of AI if you're not on the leading edge. Because
Right.
when certain things can become automated and your people resist that type of change inside of the organization, or your processes resist that change, but there's
Hmm.
new an AI native competitor to you, you're in big trouble. Like the market is
Yeah.
going to wipe you out. And so you're going to have to create an organization. Like one of the things I talked to a bunch of people about today is like you need to be thinking about reinventing all your internal processes probably every 3 months or so based on AI and how
Wow.
fast it's moving. Like
Wow.
like if we think back just what was it? November, I think when was it November when OpenAI launched O1, which was the first reasoning model?
Hmm.
That was like 6 or 7 months ago. And the amount of progress in AI, meaning the types of things you can do now with AI that you couldn't do 7 months ago, are astonishing, right?
Astonishing.
And so if you're not constantly reevaluating how work is getting done inside of the business and constantly transforming your operations around these new capabilities, you're likely going to fall behind to some AI native competitor.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, I think we're about 2 minutes short of the top of the hour. We might leave it there. We have one more comment. All right, Kevin says agreed. Jump head first. Thanks, guys. Have a fantastic week. Mark, I want to thank you for your time. I think Kremi, my colleague, is going to put a link in the chat. If folks want to provide any feedback, we thrive on feedback. We are going to take a break for the summer and not do any of these the Heart of Leadership webinars, and we will revisit in the fall if we do resume. It is a lot of work, and we're thinking about our limited resources. But if you have folks you'd like to see on the Heart of Leadership, drop us a line. Would love to connect. And Mark, thank you again for it's such an insightful conversation. And thank you to Josh and everyone at VC Platform. This has been a blast. Great one today. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.